it comes to decoding economics, there's somebody who we can trust to do that, and maybe do that in a way that can substitute for the caffeine kick that you would get otherwise from tea. Let's welcome Devinder ji. Devinder ji, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you for these lovely words. Normally, I don't get to hear them. All I get is a troll every morning I wake up and I'm on my Twitter. Well, if you get swayed by the title of this conference, In Search of Well-being, and you decide to go bicycling, you decide to use a bicycle, be sure you are not adding on to GDP. When you bicycle, you don't need petrol. When you bicycle, you don't need an insurance, health insurance. When you bicycle, you don't fall sick. And because you don't fall sick, the health industry, the pharmaceutical industry loses out. So you're actually not adding on to the GDP. So let's be very clear that what is well-being to you may not be what is well-being for the economists. On the contrary, if you buy a car, the GDP doesn't go only once. It will increase 2, 3, even 4 times. First time when you buy a car, whether it's 2 crore or 2 lakhs, the GDP goes up. You drive a car, the GDP goes up. In fact, many economists are suggesting that if you want the country's GDP to increase, the best is to increase the red light time. When your car is standing at the red light, the more it consumes petrol, the more will be the GDP. And when you drive a car, you leave the exhaust, you fall sick, I fall sick, we go to the doctor takes the fees, you pay the fees, the GDP goes up. So this is what a wonderful, phenomenal system of economic growth that the country or the nation or the globe has evolved over the years. The second scenario I want to present to you before you is, not a scenario, but a fact, is that every minute, $1 billion is the subsidy globally that goes into food production. On an average, about $700 billion is what is known to be spent on producing food. I mean, there are still explicit and implicit subsidies which are difficult to decipher. And out of this entire amount spent on producing food, only 1% goes for environmental practices or environmental farming practices systems. That's a global picture. But if you come to India, in India, it's less than 0.5% that goes for environmental protection as far as agriculture is concerned. But these two scenarios should present you a picture how we have evolved a kind of economic design that has led to the kind of a disaster or the kind of worries that affects every one of us now. Let's look at that economic design. Of course, as was said earlier, last week has been a very encouraging week. We have seen the younger people taking on the role which the adults should have taken, and the world has been shaken up with that kind of a warning that they have issued to the world. But there was a bad news also. The international community, which met to take care of or to lay out a kind of a plan for central action, the climate action, actually failed to come up with a plan. That of course tells us very clearly that why the voice of the younger people or why the anger of the younger people is so crucial and timely at this particular juncture in history. It wasn't so easy. It didn't come up in an organic way that the kind of economic system or economic structures that we have evolved. A handful of economists met at Davos in 1947. They spent about a fortnight building up a kind of economic growth model that the world eventually began to follow. The economic growth model that they developed was based on 3 principles: profit, efficiency, and consumption. So we see this cycle or the spiral cycle that we see all over the world is built on these 3 principles of economic growth. And these economists who settled down or who worked for a fortnight or so at Davos in 1947 actually evolved that kind of a parameter or the kind of a blueprint that came into practice or was put into practice globally. Gradually it began, but eventually in the 1980s, we were all ready with the kind of a system that, of course, the world is believing that there is no alternative now. We tend to believe that this is the only alternative we have got, so therefore nothing will work except for this particular system of economic growth that we have evolved over the years. So here we have come to a stage, and that particular model or economic design actually thrives on keeping food cheap. You must understand that actually that model thrives on keeping food cheap. So it is not because agriculture is unproductive or inefficient or is unable to meet the aspirations that farmers are dying or farmers are not able to pull on and so on and so forth. It is primarily because the design operates in such a manner that the economic reforms would collapse if the prices of food were to shoot up. I recall when I was a young reporter with the Indian Express, and I'm talking of the early 1980s, I had the privilege of accompanying Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Peace laureate, whenever he would come to India. And in one of my discussions, one of my travels with him, and this was way back, way early in 1980s, I asked him a question because that particular year, a Polish leader, Lech Walesa, had got the Nobel Peace Prize. So I just casually asked Norman Borlaug, I said, what do you have to say about this Nobel for Walesa? He said, I'm glad you asked me this question, because the Nobel Committee had actually set up a small team of people to go and find out. This man, Walesa, came from Poland. He eventually became the president of Poland. He said they sent a team to find out whether Walesa deserves a Nobel Prize or not. And that team was incidentally headed by Norman Borlaug. So Borlaug says when he came back, his actually report says that Walesa does not deserve a Nobel Prize. So I asked him, I said, how come? You said that he doesn't deserve a Nobel Prize, and eventually he got the Nobel Prize. So where were you wrong, or what? Why did the international community not follow your recommendations? He said, when I went there, I looked into Poland's agriculture, and if you remember, Walesa was leading a workers' solidarity movement at that time in Poland. And he said, actually, Walesa was fighting for cheaper food for the workers. But in the bargain, he was forgetting what will happen to the millions of farmers who produce that cheaper food. So therefore, Borlaug's recommendation was that this man does not deserve the Nobel Prize because he's pitting one class against the other. But eventually, the world gave him a Nobel Prize because that is what was the economic thinking. That is what would keep the economic reforms alive. No wonder whether we are in India, whether we are in China, whether we are in Europe or in America, the prices of food is being kept so low that the farmers are finding it difficult to survive. I met a farmer recently when I was traveling to America. He said took me to his barn, and then he showed me a slip which was hanging there, pasted by his grandfather in 1971. With the price of soybean that his grandfather sold was about $3.2 per bushel, and he said, I paid $3 now. In 1971, the grandfather paid a higher price than what he was now paying, or he was now getting, for the corn that he was producing. Now, this is not happening only in America. If you look at globally, the design works so efficiently that the farmers, the prices that the farmers get in India, for instance, I've been saying for long, have remained static or frozen for the last 4 decades. The price that you get for tomato or for wheat today is almost the same that you used to get 4 decades earlier if you adjust for inflation. There was a report of UNTAD. UNTAD report said that the output price globally of food between 1985 and 2005 20-year period had remained static or had remained frozen. That was an UNTAD report which talked about the first 20 years that I want to talk about. The next 20 years, recently there's a report which has come out from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in association with a New Delhi-based institute called ICRIER. The report says in the period 2000 and 2017, Indian farmers lost 45 lakh crores. Repeat the figure again. Indian farmers lost 45 lakh crore because they couldn't realize the price they were supposed to get. Imagine for last 40 years, farmers are being paid the same price. If you and me were in that category, If our salaries had remained static for the last 40 years, I'm sure many of us would have committed suicide or would have quit the job. Now, the tragedy is that this is how it has been woven around. The entire economic design has been so cast that the farmer, we believe, he's somebody who has to toil hard. Perhaps, we need to be living off him rather than being worried about him. And therefore, no, I wasn't surprised when the finance minister recently, or last week or so, when she announced economic stimulus package to counter the economic slowdown the country was facing, she announced economic stimulus package which cut the tax exemption, which reduced the tax exemption for the corporates by 1.45 lakh crores. And we were being told there are poor people who can't buy the 5 rupee packet of Britannia biscuits. But look, the next day the rejoicing was happening at the stock exchange. They were the one who were celebrating that kind of a rebate that was given for the tax concession. So the point is, we are not actually wanting to see that the poor or the masses are the ones which have to be taken care of. We are only ensuring that the bigger economic activity that we call it is one which should be always benefited. In fact, I have always been saying that the economic design has been so well crafted that actually it thrives on sucking the income from the bottom to the top. It isn't the trickle-down effect that we all consider or we all know about, but it actually sucks the income from the bottom to the top. And I have given an example, which I again repeat here for the benefit of the audience, that if there is a poorest of the poor women in a village, she doesn't have anything to look up to, but she decides for her own, livelihood, she wants to buy a goat, a bakri. How much will that cost? 10,000 rupees at the maximum? She goes to a microfinance institute. The microfinance institute will give her 10,000 rupees at 26% rate of interest, which has to be paid back at weekly intervals, which means eventually she ends up paying at 60% rate of interest. On the contrary, the Tatas have to set up a nano factory. The Gujarat government gives them all the benefits, all the attractions that you know of land, water, and so on and so forth. And on top of it, gives them 520 crore rupees as a loan at a 0.1% rate of interest to be paid back in 20 years. This is how the income is being sucked from the bottom to the top. And I'm sure you will all agree with me, if this poor lady in the village had got that 10,000 rupees at 0.1% rate of interest, she would have been driving a nano car at the end of the year. But the design is so prevalent that, we want to keep the poor where they are. And we think that the economic growth only takes place if we help one section of the society. Kaushik Basu, the former chief economic advisor of the World Bank, had in a tweet said that in America, in the last 9 years, they printed 36 trillion US dollars as surplus money. 36 trillion US dollars, and there was no murmur. There was not even a discussion on this. Where did that money go? $36 trillion. And let me take you back, before I answer this, let me also take you back to a period of 2009, when at the World Economic Forum at Davos, the Oxfam came out with a report saying that the wealth growth that has happened for the rich in just 1 year was almost $240 billion, which could have wiped out poverty from the face of the planet for 4 times over. $240 billion getting into the hands of 1% of the population, which was good enough to wipe out poverty from the face of the planet. But that doesn't end there. Imagine $36 trillion. I'm sure you and me would all think of that money should have been used for eradicating poverty, killing inequality, and so on and so forth. But no. On the contrary, it was distributed as what is called as federal bonds. Federal bonds means it goes into the hands of the rich people who invest that kind of a bond or the amount of money into the stock exchange of emerging economies like India, Brazil, or South Africa, and so on. And they are able to, of course, repatriate the profits. And what happens? Where has the 36 trillion gone? That is basically building on the kind of economic growth that we talked about. There's a price or there's a cost for that economic growth that we see. We normally believe it is an outcome of what? Efficiency. We believe it's an outcome of productivity. On the contrary, we say it is basically an outcome of the entire treasury being opened up for the sake of a handful of people. And that's how the design has worked. But somehow we as a society, we have remained elusive. We have remained away from these kinds of complexities because we believe that there is no other alternative. We believe this is the economic growth model that we have to follow because we have been programmed, as Sita said earlier, we have been programmed to believe that unless there is economic growth, the world would come to an end. In fact, when the climate change negotiations were happening, and there was a mention that in the 6-7 days now, or 6-7 years is the time left for the climate to go topsy-turvy, the person who literally cried in an interview was the chairperson of Exxon. And he said, my God, if the world finishes up in 6-7 years, then what about the oil that is still in the surface? He said, look at the wealth that still lies and we will be deprived of that. So it tells you very clearly where the interests lie. And somehow we have never been able to understand. It doesn't even end there. Last week, I was telling some of my friends, there was a report which did not attract any headline internationally. It said very clearly there was a technical glitch in the stock markets. So the markets have to be rescued. In a midnight coup, the American government or the American Fed pumped in $53 billion to save the stock markets. Was it mentioned everywhere? $53 billion could have wiped out poverty from the face of the planet. But that's the amount of money that is being spent to keep the economic reforms alive. That's how the economic reforms thrive. But somehow we believe it's because of the efficiency, the kind of consumption pattern. Of course, consumption pattern is an outcome which we all need to be concerned about, but more of the production that we talk about, the link between production and efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a stage that we really need to look back, take a step back, and try to see where are we heading towards. The young girl from Sweden has sown that seed of revolt, I would say. And when I say that, when I see her in an angry mode, I feel very delighted. Because that's the kind of anger which is missing in the society. That's the kind of anger which I thought the elder people who have been implicated or who have been part of the kind of a crisis happening should have really stood up, and who are being impacted by all these policies should have stood up. They failed. They failed because of two reasons. There are two reasons. First, one is the fear of missing out. The other one is the fear of being left out. We need to understand. When the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty was to be signed, I'm glad at least Donald Trump did one good thing. He came and threw that away. That many countries wanted to be part of it because the fear of missing out. They know that's going to be damaging for us, but still they wanted to be there because they fear that if we are not there, then we'll be lost. That was the kind of a reaction that happened. It is happening now in India. I don't know how many of you are aware there's something called as RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership between 16 countries. The agreement is going to come into place by December. It didn't come into place earlier because India and Indonesia were to go for elections. And if it had come before, I'm sure the governments would have found it difficult to survive. But nevertheless, we are now ready with that kind of a protocol or the kind of a prototype that is going to come. The industry in India, by and large, the majority industry in India, including and plus the dairy sector of India, have warned the government again and again that once we become partners in the RCEP treaty, with China, Australia, and New Zealand also being there, we would be swamped by cheaper imports because the treaty makes it very clear. The obligation is that 92% of your tariff lines that you import have to be at 0% duty. Imagine the kind of flood of imports that will open up in this country. But the fear of missing out is what is actually holding on. That is what is making India to join that club. I don't know whether India also needs a Trump to throw RCEP out. That's a different question. But then the other part is, when we talk of the economic design, most of us who feel angry, most of us who feel that there's something going wrong, do not stand up. Do not stand up for the simple reason because you fear that you will be left out. You want to be part of the mainstream, but you fear that once you stand up against the mainstream, you will be left out, you will be marginalized. Majority of us, whether we like it or not, play to that game. And that is why we go on having a kind of a system. We know that the system is not effective, is not something that benefits each and every one, but still we support it because we don't want to be out of that main line or the mainstream that we talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to a state now that the world is faced with a terrible, terrible crisis. The $1 billion that we spend every minute on food and agriculture has actually devastated the soils. The soil health has gone to, as you know, from the organic matter in the soil has gone down to almost zero. Then, of course, the mining that takes place, the virtual mining of water being pumped out from the groundwater levels has also dried even the aquifers. We know pesticides and chemical fertilizers have done a tremendous damage, and eventually what is happening to our own human health is an outcome of, or the kind of a disaster that we see, health problem that we see all around, is the outcome of the food that we eat. After all, you are what you eat. And if your food is contaminated, first of all, if your soil is contaminated, your food is contaminated. And if your food is contaminated, your health obviously would be affected by that. This chain is very clear. And no wonder I see that globally, if you try to understand, the economic designs works like this. There is the Trimurti of the global economic design works like this. First of all, there is the food companies on one hand, then we have the trading companies on the other hand, and the third are the supermarkets, or these are the main players as far as food is concerned. But then, otherwise, if you look at it, this is the food sector. But then if you look at the other economic sector, there is a food industry, there is the health and pharmaceutical industry, and there is the insurance industry. The insurance industry pumps in about $6 to $7 trillion of money into the food industry every year. Why? Because unless the food is contaminated, the economic growth will not take place. The more the food is contaminated, the more you require pharmaceuticals, the health industry, your hospitalization, and so on and so forth. The more you require hospitalization and pharmaceuticals and so on, more you require the insurance. So it's all woven in. It's all woven in. Only we have refused to see how the system works, how the system evolves over the years. In case of agriculture, over the last few decades, the way agriculture has been devastating all over the world, we have now estimates which show clearly that if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, not only from agriculture produces about 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, but if you take right from deforestation to the waste, roughly about 47 to 57% of the greenhouse gas emissions comes from that kind of agriculture. And which means agriculture doesn't only need a kind of a remedy or steps that should mitigate the impact for the farmers or for the consumers, but I think what is more important is how can agriculture be redesigned in a manner that the global climate can be what you and me aspire or we desire that it should be. So the effort should be to change that kind of a farming systems that we have evolved over the years. But the farming system is so well entrenched with such a strong interest, commercial interest behind it, that to every small change, there is a kind of a huge reaction that takes place. So whether it's natural farming in India, we have a number of people now standing up and saying clearly, oh, this will take the country back into the era of ship-to-mouth existence. And so we should try to emerge out of it, try to stay out of that position when India was importing cheaper food going directly into the hungry mouths. Now that's a situation, that's a warning, that's a kind of a fear psychosis that is being created. And so that you don't move on to that kind of a system which is self-evolving or in a way very regenerative kind of a system of agriculture. But can the world move into in that direction? Well, the economic design may presently not allow that space. But globally, I am so excited that over the last few years, the kind of reaction internationally and nationally is so positive in that direction that even the Prime Minister of India is now saying that farmers should get away from chemical fertilizers. So I think that realization is coming. That realization is coming that chemical fertilizer, chemical pesticides, the mechanization at the pace which has taken place is something that has not only destroyed agriculture, but is one reason why we are keeping agriculture impoverished. The farming communities are, as I said, they are not inefficient. They are not something that we should worry about or give up on that, but they are victims of an economic design that it doesn't make us or give us that space to understand how it is happening. In India, what is the kind of income that a farmer gets every month or every year? I was surprised when the Economic Survey 2016 itself acknowledged for the first time that the average income of a farming family in India, and that is in 17 states of India, which means half the country, is only 20,000 rupees a year. Imagine if after all the hard work, the average income of a farming family is less than 1,700 rupees a month. You cannot rear a cow, you cannot bring up a cow in 1,700 rupees a month. Imagine how that farmer is surviving on 1,700 rupees a month. And we still believe that agriculture, if you go to the television channels and watch those programs, they always think agriculture is highly subsidized. And then again, this is the narrative. It is very cleverly built. When you use the word subsidy, a word which has been demonized, the first impression you have is, oh, this is the money which is a wastage. It's money going down the drain. It's a dole which should not be given. And who are these people who get the benefit of subsidies? Are of course the poor, by way of fertilizer subsidies, by way of food subsidies, by way of other subsidies. So we have a fiscal deficit, Lakshman Rekha enacted, which says that you should not be exceeding 3.3% of the budget as the support on subsidies. But when it comes to corporates, we don't call it subsidy. We call it incentives for growth. An incentive for growth, you and me believe that's something which is required. So when we have to give money to the poor, we call it subsidy. When we give it to the corporates, we call it economic stimulus. So we have these jargons, and that actually has enabled all of us to fit into a kind of a thinking that has gone on over the years. We as society, we refuse to understand what is the incentive when we say incentive for growth, and what is subsidy. Isn't subsidy an incentive for growth? If you give money, 500 rupees per month, to a farmer now under the PM Kisan scheme, direct income support, I think it's an incentive for growth. Imagine for a man who is earning 20,000 rupees a year, even if he gets 500 rupees per month, it is too low. And I'm sure it will increase in the years to come. But it's a good beginning. What is wrong in that? But when we give money to the 1% rich in this country, we all celebrate. We rejoice. The stock markets go up. The newspapers go gaga. This is the kind of economic reforms the country needs. And we all begin to celebrate that kind of a development process. We are, in fact, responsible for the world that we have created. Let's be very clear, ladies and gentlemen. The next time you blame the governments, you can blame the governments, blame the industry, blame all players, but don't forget to blame yourself also. Because when you were quiet, because you have not raised your voice, that is why the world goes along at a pace that it is finding it comfortable. Now look at India. We talk of the black hole. You know what black hole is. But there is another black hole in India. You go on pumping money in that black hole, and you never get to know where that money disappears. Since 2004, 2005, we have actually given a tax deduction or a revenue foregone of 5% of the GDP every year to the corporate sector. If I were to total it, it comes to about 50 lakh crores has been given to that sector. 50 lakh crore could have wiped out poverty from India for 100 years. And where has that 50 lakh crore? Do we even know? Again, on top of it, we have given another stimulus of 1.45 lakh crore recently now per year that will go. And that will add on to, I am sure, the 5% figure of GDP would now become 6% of the GDP. And on top of it, we have written off the corporate loans in the last 12 years from 2007 till today. 8.5 lakh crore roughly is the amount that has been written off for the corporates, 8.5 lakh crore. On top of it, there is a 17 lakh crore stressed loan that the government is now worried about, and out of which 14 lakh crore is not going to come back. So there are tax concessions, there are incentives, and so on. And yet we don't know where the black hole is going into. We don't even know where the money is going into that black hole. Money saved is money earned. I thought that is what we learned when I was a student or when we were a student. Money saved, for them, they have not paid the taxes, it has gone into their pockets, because after all, the taxes exemption that the government of India gave was actually for what? To increase productivity, to increase industrial production, to increase manufacturing, to increase exports, and to provide jobs. Nothing like that happened. So where did that money go? And that money could have revived Indian agriculture or revived economy in such a manner that we would have by now what is called Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Imagine, we are being told that the 7th Pay Commission in India is good enough. It will be providing a booster dose. As Sita said, 7% of the economy is basically in the organized sector. But if you look at the government employees, I think they are 3 or 4% of the population. So 3 or 4% of the population, we provide the 7th Pay Commission, which actually the industry is very happy. It says that it will act as a booster dose for the economy, because that money would be eventually spent for buying goods, and which means more demand would be created. More demand, which means the industrial output will go up. Imagine if 50% of the population, which is farmers, were to get a higher stimulus package. Imagine the demand it would generate. Imagine the demand it would generate, because after all, these poor people are going to come and spend that market, whether for buying biscuits or whether for buying motorcycles. That money, that demand would create a kind of industrial revolution in this country. So not only a booster dose for the economy, I think that would be a rocket dose for the economy. But then, because it doesn't figure in the economics 101 textbooks, nobody's talking about. Fear of losing out. Even those economists who think that this is not correct are often reluctant to say that openly, because they fear that they will be kept out of the mainstream economics. And I face that almost every day. This kind of a dilemma, that whether I should be stepping on into the arena of those who claim that they know everything, or whether I should be quietly keeping my voice mum because I want to be seen in that particular group. I think that is a bigger tragedy that we as a society have fermented for ourselves over the years. Now, when we say that this kind of amount of money is what is needed, it is not only happening in India, it's happening globally. The income inequalities that the world is witnessing, of course, you all know, has reached a phenomenal level. And when I talked about the $1 million of subsidies that goes into agriculture, you'll be surprised, and I don't know how many of you know that, Queen Elizabeth is one of the biggest recipients of agriculture subsidies. Prince Charles is one of the bigger recipients of agriculture subsidies. Half the cabinet of Holland is getting subsidies in their name. And David Rockefeller and Ted Turner are recipients of huge subsidies. So the subsidy structure is so designed that globally the $700 billion of farm subsidies that I talked about, actually 80% of it goes to the rich. The rest, 20%, is what is shared between the farmers, the research programs, and other kind of programs, and so on and so forth. Now, once the 80% goes bust, and that is what we are saying, if the $700 billion subsidies were to really be transformed or redesigned or redirected in a manner that it could benefit the small farmers or the majority farmers across the globe, imagine the kind of change it will bring to the economic growth that we all talk about. Now, is there a way out? Is the world in a position to really struggle out of this kind of a situation or not? And perhaps what should be the way out, or what should be the kind of a paradigm that we need to build on if we really want an economic growth model for everyone? Well, ladies and gentlemen, first look at agriculture. Agriculture, I said, and I've said earlier also, soil. Soil is the basis of human life, but soil is also something which civilizations were built on a good soil. A good soil is paramount to any kind of economic growth that we need to talk about. I see no reason why the entire global effort should not go into regenerating soil. And there are various ways of doing it. Let's not get worried. A report, IPCC report recently has cautioned us very clearly that 100 times more soil is being destroyed than what is being created, or what the cultivable land which is being saved. So it is, the warning is there before us, and the deserts are creeping at a fast pace all over the world. In India, about 30% of the land has become desert. In fact, my worrying part is that the states that we can't even imagine are now getting more, there's more desertification happening in those states. Goa, for instance, 50% desertification. Jharkhand, 50% desertification. Andhra Pradesh, Punjab, they're all faced with desertification. And at this pace of desertification taking place and the water getting exhausted, I think the combination of this can be seen as to what is going to happen in the future. Now, that's something we need to redesign, restructure, and move on to a kind of a farming system, which is based on traditional knowledge, which is based on the kind of biodiversity strength that the country has or the world has at this particular joint. Once you put that kind of a model together, you will be able to evolve a regenerative economic model of growth, which will actually not be dependent upon fossil fuels or not be dependent on that infinite growth that we talk about. As somebody has said very, very rightly so, he said, when we rely on the infinite potential of economic growth, you can either be mad or you are an economist. The choice is yours. But I think we need to understand that there is no infinite limit as far as economic growth is concerned. And the world has done enough damage to go on in this direction, believing that if there is no growth, then the world is going to crumble. It brings me back to something which I started off by saying. If I steal your car and then sell it, the GDP grows up. So this phenomena of economic growth, I think we need to decipher it in a manner that people can understand. And that is why often, if you have heard me, I've always tried to share that if a tree is standing, there is no economic growth. But if you cut down the tree, there's economic growth. Now the choice is yours. Do you need the tree or do you need economic growth? Now what looks to you attractive, I think we must understand that once we move this agriculture subsidies, and I'm coming back to the subject of agriculture, from the kind of investment that we are now having, $700 billion, to a kind of a natural farming systems, we would be creating employment. We would be creating additional employment in these areas. So the pressure has to move from urban employment to the moving employment into the rural areas. But the global design is very clear. It says by 2050, 70% of the population would be living in the urban areas. Today we know that more the emissions, more is the economic growth. More the greenhouse gases, more is the economic growth. More the destruction of natural resources, more is the economic growth. More the pumping of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash into the soil, more is economic growth. More is the food contaminated, more is economic growth. Do you all want to continue with that kind of economic growth model? Isn't it time that we take a relook at what the economic growth model should be? If I were to help a poor woman to have a livelihood, decent livelihood in the rural areas, isn't that economic growth? It may not fit into the definition of the economic growth that the economists have given us, but I think that is the kind of world that we need to move on to. A world where sharing and caring becomes the principle. Participatory development. It should not be only dependent upon materialistic growth that we all talk about. That's the kind of world we need on to, and I think agriculture is a classic example. And if we were to actually set agriculture right, believe me, most of the ills plaguing this economic model design would be corrected. And that is where the ball lies, and that is where we refuse to act. The reason being, we are all disconnected from the rural areas today. I remember when I was a child, there was a radio ad which would say, Mohan ghee kya khaya, gaon se nata hi toot gaya. Now anyone who is gone into education, the kind of education system we have, uska bhi gaon se nata toot gaya. You know, when we go to the village, we say, we are coming to help you. We by and large go there to exploit them. And that's the kind of economic design the world has created. When they come out from the West to help us, they are actually coming to exploit our resources. And when we go back into the villages to help the poor, we also do the same. This kind of a system has become prevalent all over the world. So the bigger shark, as they say, eats away the smaller fish. And that model has prevailed. And that's why I remember in one of the former agriculture secretaries at the time of Ronald Reagan, when he was the US president, had said, get big or get out. That is what the world is following. In agriculture, you are being asked to become big, hand over your land or whatever, go for corporate kind of agriculture, or you get out of the agriculture. So that's the kind of a model we created, and once these people get out of agriculture, they'll be swarming into the cities, and that is the economic growth model that we have before you. You know, if the population moves into the cities, that is taken as an ultimate indicator of development. Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI chief, I don't know why we go on, applauding people who look like poster boys. He said very clearly that the biggest ticket reforms in India would be when we move people out of agriculture into the urban areas, because urban areas need cheap labor. What he was suggesting was, because cities need the hardy mazdoor, you must pull these people out of agriculture into the urban areas. If that is the model of growth, ladies and gentlemen, you are happy with, I have nothing to say. But if that is a model of growth which you resent, I think at the time is very important, very crucial, that we must stand up and make our voice felt. I was very happy when I walked into this hall, walking into the hall. I found some younger people carrying this message, "We are Bhoomi." I was very happy to see that. I remember when I was a member of Team Anna and we had the movement India Against Corruption, the slogan which caught up the imagination of the country was, "Main bhi Anna, tu bhi Anna." And I think you are not only you are Bhoomi, I am also Bhoomi. So I am Bhoomi, you are Bhoomi, she is Bhoomi, everyone is Bhoomi. That's the kind of a slogan, that's the kind of messaging I think the society requires at present. Maybe Anna, let's learn from that, and let's learn from where Bhoomi has given us a message today, very resounding, that maybe Bhoomi. I would like that message to be now everywhere, maybe Bhoomi. You are also Bhoomi, I am also Bhoomi. So that message, the message that you want to percolate, the message that you have conveyed, and the message for which you have brought us all together, I think is what can resonate, what can create that kind of a ripple impact that the world needs to do. And let's not forget, as I said earlier, when we talked about Greta, the kind of anger she has, and many people, of course, have been abusing her left and right because they feel that will be the end of the world if what she says will come through. But I think the more important task is that people who gain control over their own resources, or people who gain control over their own fate or on their future, are the ones who will have the last shot, or who will be calling the shot. And I think what she has done is what Nelson Mandela had once said. He had said that the biggest tragedy of 21st century is that we have lost our anger. And he said, when I say anger, I don't mean you go and plant a bomb. Anger is your ability to digest, to comprehend, to decipher, and then stand up and ask a question. I think what Greta is doing is she understands and she's asking a question. It may be very uncomfortable for all of us. But remember and try to understand that if each one of us were to stand up and start asking an uncomfortable question, imagine the kind of a ripple impact or the kind of a surge that the world would witness in anger. And that is what the world requires. I am very hopeful that this two-day conference, and I, as one of those who has been coming back again and again because I see a ray of hope here very clearly and very loudly, I am very hope that this will be, as Neil Armstrong said once, he said, just one small step for a man and a giant leap for mankind. Thank you.